So now we turn to verse 25. It's the story of Rahab. Now, there's not much to this. It says, in the same way, was Rahab the prostitute not justified by works also when she received the messengers and sent them out by another way? The answer, of course, is yes, she was. Well, that is not a standalone sentence. It has a context to it. And the context, as we learned in the last lesson, that you see a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. We might translate that as you see that a person is not only approved by faith, but they can be justified by works as well. So when you look at the grammar, understand the adverb and all that we talked about, it's talking about two justifications. Now, this turns out to be rather important because James is opening with in the same way. Elsewhere is translated likewise. And it goes to the context immediately of that transition verse of verse 24. Now, bear in mind, what we've learned is that James is addressing an adversary. And this adversary is saying, hey, works prove faith. If you see works, you can know the person believes. If they believe, you'll know they'll do works. But James has been unraveling that error because he's teaching that faith and works are separate things that should never be separated. Establishing that fact first as dead faith or useless faith, he transitions to deal with the adversary beginning in verse 20. And in doing so, he wants to bring up two examples, one of Abraham that we've discussed, and this role of works working together with, synergizing with faith, such that Abraham was approved of God, justified in the sense of stepping into a relationship that God called friendship. Well, he sums that with that you see a person is justified or approved by works and not by faith alone. So when he says likewise, he's giving yet another example. And curiously, Rahab is a Gentile, not a Jew. And it may have to do with James's awareness that both Jew and Gentiles were made into one new man. And so this new game of the church had these two groups reconciled. So he gives an example in dealing with the adversary of a Jew, or the father of the faith, Abraham, and then a Gentile, Rahab. And both are examples of how works justified them. They were approved. In Rahab's case, rescued in particular. So understanding this story of Rahab is somewhat essential. What's amazing is what the commentators do with this verse and with this idea. You literally cannot read the commentaries and make sense of them if you only had this verse. And if you have the story in the Old Testament, in Joshua, you can't make sense of it. What you have to have is the adversary's theology, and you have to assume a lot of things about Rahab. So the story itself, spies are sent into the land. Rahab finds the spies. She hides them. She sends the king's henchmen off down the road looking for them, and she sends him out another way. And in that way, there was a deal cut where she said, rescue me and rescue my family. These spies of Israel told Joshua, and Joshua honored their promise and rescued Rahab and her whole family. So when we look at this, what we need to appreciate is what is actually here. First, Rahab was a prostitute. We also know she's in the direct line through whom Jesus came to this earth. Well, in that context, all we know is Rahab, this prostitute, did something. Doesn't say anything about her believing or having faith. or certainly having eternal life through faith. All those things must be assumed. And if they're true, they're true. But we don't know them from the Bible. What we see, if we stay in the book of James, is only that she was approved when she received the messengers and sent them out by another way. That's all we've got. Well, in what sense was she justified, or what sense was she rescued? It's physical. She didn't die with all the people in Jericho. Now, to appreciate this, we're going to need to go back to a few verses and look at them in the context of Joshua. In Joshua 2:14, it says, "So the men said to her, 'Our life for yours, if you do not tell this business of ours. And it shall come about that when the Lord gives us the land, we will deal kindly and faithfully with you.' Then she let down the rope through the window, for her house was on the city wall, so that she was living on the wall." And then the story goes on, as we've said, to send away the king's men and to have these men go out a different way. That's actually all we know. So, what did she believe about God? Had she put her faith in God's answer to her eternal sin problem? Was she at this stage a believer? Well, we don't have any information like that. What we do have is these words in Joshua 2:11. "When we heard these reports, our hearts melted, and no courage remained in anyone any longer because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God in heaven above and on earth below." Those are the words of Rahab. But notice she says, "the Lord your God," not the Lord my God. But she is affirming he is God in heaven above and on earth. Well, that actually makes her a theist. Maybe she believed the Shema as we looked at it earlier. But all that's acknowledged here is that she believes the God of Israel is going to take Jericho. So she acknowledges he exists. She probably does want to seek his approval or protection, but she rather is focused on these men. And her report, her orientation is for the Lord your God. He's God in heaven and on earth. This is very similar to what James said in verse 19. You believe God is one. You believe in this one God, the one true God of heaven above and earth below, and you do good. The demons believe this same thing. It's amazing that the commentaries don't tend to notice this, but she's believing the same thing that James and the demons believed about the oneness of God. That's all. There's no redemptive message in any of this. I think she became a believer. We can speculate on that. Pretty sure she did. She converted to Judaism, and she's in the line of Jesus. I bet she knew the Lord eternally. But in this context, there's no discussion or connection to her having some kind of faith, or her saving faith forced her to save these men. In fact, why would we possibly imagine that she's a believer given the limited information we have? Well, the only reason is because we need her to be one. That's not what James is talking about. James is looking at the power of her works, and her works were to honor God and to rescue her family. If she was a believer, why in the world did God, through Joshua, save the whole family? She wasn't justified for them. And that's because the works here are tied to this promise to these men, and they go straight before Joshua. In Joshua chapter 6, verse 20, the people shouted, the priest blew the trumpets, and when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, they shouted with a great shout, and the walls fell down. In verse 21, they utterly destroyed everything in the city, both man and woman, young and old, and ox, sheep, and donkey, with the edge of the sword. They took that city. But in verse 22, we find, and Joshua said to the two men who had spied out the land, go into the prostitute's house and bring the woman and all she has out of there, just as you rather have sworn to her. And so the young men went in, verse 23, who were spies, went in, brought out Rahab, her father, her mother, her brothers, and all she had. They also brought out all her relatives and placed them outside the camp of Israel. She was rescued. It goes back to that word saved in James 2:14. She was delivered, same word, rescued. And it was physically kept alive. And it was strictly on the basis of her works. Now, am I saying that she had no faith? No, as we learned earlier, when we take an action, we have something we're believing. Faith may prompt an action, but it doesn't produce it. This woman could have not helped them. She could have said no. She could have turned them in out of fear, out of whatever reason. There's nothing that suggests that she had no option. That's why it's on the works. However, she certainly had faith, but not the kind you think. In Hebrews, we find these words, by faith, the prostitute Rahab did not perish along with those who were disobedient after she'd welcomed the spies in peace. So it was certainly by faith. But what is the faith she had in the story? It was tied to hope. Faith, remember, is certainty. Hope is when we think something's possible, not guaranteed, but possible, a good thing. But faith has the assurance, the certainty of things hoped for, even in this same chapter 11 of the book of Hebrews. So when it says that by faith the prostitute did not perish along with those who were disobedient, it's contrasting her with the disobedient. So Jericho, those people were outlined or labeled by the writer of Hebrews as disobedient, not even their unbelieving. But her faith, her hope for sure, but some certainty that she had made this deal with the spies, and as a result, she trusted in them to go to Joshua and deliver her, and it turned out her family and relatives. So when we look at this, we're seeing that there was a faith in operation, but it was the faith of that moment. It wasn't believing a promise of God. There was no promise of God there for her. The promise was on the part of the spies. God was not her deliverer. Joshua was her deliverer. Now, in the providence of God, God certainly provided Joshua and delivered her, but that's not the story, because this is the conversation to the people who are receiving the book from James, this letter. He's moved in this discussion from Abraham to now this Gentile who acted with her faith. And in that combination of that moment of faith, being willing to trust the spies, she took action. That is the mechanism of deliverance. That's the sense of how she was approved. But her approval was with Joshua. And God, in that act, providentially rescued her. So let me just stress that this is a justification by works. That, in fact, is our context. Again, that verse 24 says, you see that a person is justified by works and not only by faith. Two justifications. There's a by faith one, which is being credited with righteousness. But this second is a justification, an approval by works. And Rahab is a likewise example. It was her works in combination with her trust in that context of the spies that gained her approval and deliverance. What you find in the commentaries is that they substitute justification by works with justification by works produced by faith. So they have to have an assumption in here about some driving force within her faith, her regenerate self, perhaps, that drives her to do the right thing. If you read Joshua, just after this context, there's the story of Achan. He stole some things. He hid them, and he got caught, and he came clean about it. And the next thing, he was dead. There's a judgment on him. No reason to think he wasn't a believer. But it just goes to show there's no guarantee because a person is a believer, they will do any particular work in any particular moment. And these commentators have to assume that. But where is that in James? Where is that in Joshua? That's not this story. This story is a second example that is demonstrating the power of obedience and works in combination with faith. Those together do something marvelous. That's why I keep mentioning James 4:17. For him who knows the right thing to do and does not do it, to him it's sin. Rahab chose the better way. She chose that justification, that approval. That meant she's part of history. That meant her family was delivered. Practically speaking, all this means is that God is inviting you and me to act along with what we believe. This is integrity. It's practical. And in context, Rahab was protected from judgment, which goes all the way back to chapter 2, verse 12, where in discussing this law of freedom, we're invited to realize we'll be evaluated based on what we say and what we do. Abraham is an example. Rahab's an example. And next, James pulls it together with an incredible picture that is simple and should become a part of our standard conversation to encourage one another. See you next time. Would you do me a favor and subscribe, and do a friend a favor and share?